Hello and welcome to Frankly Speaking, where we dive deep into regional headlines to speak with leading policymakers and business leaders. I am Katie Jensen. With GCC governments and the UK set to enter their third round of their free trade talks in the coming weeks, we speak with former UK diplomat Paul McGrade to ask what the deal could entail, whether we could see an agreement before the end of this year, and given the political upheaval of the last 12 months, whether GCC leaders can really trust the British government's trade promises. Mr. McGrade, thank you for joining us on Frankly Speaking. Now, last month, the UK government said they were committed to signing a significant trade deal with GCC governments. But frankly speaking, given the political rollercoaster that the UK underwent in 2022 and the fact that it is no longer the manufacturing giant of the last century, why should GCC countries still be interested? And can they trust that London will deliver?
Well, it's a fair question after 6 years, really, of instability in the UK, a country that always prided itself and partly sold itself on its political stability and its business-friendly regulation. It has been a bit of a roller coaster, but I think that the high tide of Brexit disruption, if you like, has passed, and the government in London got a bit of a rude shock from the global markets when it tried to really double down under Prime Minister Liz Truss on the idea of a deregulatory, tax-cutting agenda to really make the most out of Brexit. Global markets didn't have confidence that the government could deliver that. We now have, I think, a slightly chastened government under Rishi Sunak, which is much more determined to put economic stability and predictability on regulation as well as public finances at the heart of its programme. But I think the crucial point is, and this is why I say the high tide of Brexit has gone out, the government and the main opposition Labour Party, I think, are now committed to they would say making Brexit work, but what they really mean is sound public finances, a more stable regulatory relationship with Europe, a more predictable one where essentially the UK will broadly follow what the EU is doing in big areas like net zero. So that gives investors some confidence, I think. The UK is not going to be towing itself off into mid-Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean. It's going to be geographically, obviously, and in regulatory terms, very firmly anchored in the European neighbourhood. So that gives a bit of confidence, I think, and a bit of stability going forward. And the UK needs investment. Investment has dropped off sharply since the 2016 vote. It needs investment, and both main parties are going to make economic growth the centrepiece of their pitch to British electors for an election that needs to be held by January 2025 and will probably be more likely in the autumn of 2024. So there's an environment here where businesses need the investment, governments need the strategic relationship. And, if you look at the big global picture, unlike the US, Europe and including the UK, they don't have an easy path to energy independence. The war in Ukraine, I think, has really refocused minds on the importance of the strategic partnership with the Gulf. So I think not just through the trade deal, actually, that could help in some areas, but it's a broader picture. There's a huge opportunity here for Gulf states and their investors to kind of reshape this relationship in the sectors that they might want to draw into their own economies in terms of building sustainable, high-skilled models for the future.
And I think that economic policy is going to be key. If we look back, the Conservative government in the post-Brexit era had promised that Britain would be able to make trade deals all over the world. However, they missed their targets last year. In fact, the UK has only signed trade agreements with about 60% of their global trade. We've recently seen talks with the US and India now stall. So tell me, is right now really the time for the UK to be trying to make an agreement with the Arab world?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right, Katie, that some of those talks have stalled, but some of them probably weren't very realistic anyway. The domestic politics on both sides of the Atlantic, I think, probably ruled out the kind of deep trade deal with the US that some Brexiteers said they wanted. India doesn't really have a modern, ambitious free trade deal with anyone, and that's an economy that is. I think wrestling with its own internal divisions over degrees of protecting its domestic industry. And again, there are politics at play on things like visas. I think it's a different picture when you look at the Arab world and especially the GCC, because there's a very strong historic relationship. I think there are obviously difficult issues in any trade deal about market access, but the relationship is probably more positive and the politics less difficult around the content of that trade deal. And I think the other sort of big picture point, which I mentioned in the last answer, was that across a lot of the economic sectors, although the UK is in a weak position economically now, some of the fundamentals are pretty strong in areas like health tech, digital health. We've got our Arab Health Week, of course, and creative industries, net zero technology, the traditional strengths in areas like banking, other professional services. These are sectors that matter to Gulf economies and may matter increasingly as we look towards kind of building sustainable post-net zero economies. So there's a lot on offer in the UK, and probably some of it's underpriced because of the economic hit that the country has taken over the last few years. So, I'd argue that this probably is a very good time to invest, whether or not we have a trade deal quickly. But this trade deal potentially is an easier one to do than, say, US or India in political terms.
Well, you've touched on it a little bit there, but as the UK seeks to diversify its trade and investment relationships, how important will Gulf states be in providing access to new markets, energy sources, and other areas?
I think it's going to be vital, really. And I think if you look at this sort of strategic level, as I mentioned, the war in Ukraine, I think, has refocused minds in London and, of course, across Europe on the importance of that strategic relationship. So if you see a Europe that is cutting itself off from traditional Russian supplies of oil and gas, and is also, I think, recalibrating the relationship with China. So the US talks openly about decoupling from Chinese supply chains, for example. The UK talks similar kind of language. It's probably a bit closer to the US than some of the big European powers on this. If that's the kind of world that we're going to, then the Gulf states become more important than ever, not just for energy, but for the markets that they represent, the investment and the partnerships that they're looking to build. When you look at the scale of the ambition in the Gulf, not just for sort of investment for return, but for the huge long-term sustainability projects that governments, sovereign wealth funds and other investors are aiming for there, there's a huge opportunity, but one for some genuine partnerships where some of those innovative technologies that I think genuinely the UK still excels at could really be a part of building up that sustainable skills base in Gulf economies. But I think as you look into the 21st century kind of more broadly, the region is extremely well placed. And I've used the analogy before of a kind of latter-day Venice, balancing between East and West. The region will still have strong links with China, I'm sure. Energy needs there are huge and growing. The region will continue, I hope, to have strong links with the West. There's a difficult balancing act, no doubt. That's going to get harder in the decades ahead. But the region is very strongly placed, and I think you already see with the UK and Europe more broadly a stronger recognition that this is a strategic partnership or a set of strategic partnerships bilaterally that they can't afford to ignore.
Okay, well, let's talk about some of those opportunities in a little bit more detail, because the UK estimates that an FTA with the GCC would add about £1.6 billion to its economy. But what is in it for governments like Saudi Arabia or the UAE? You mentioned some of the mega projects there, but what are the main sectors that you expect to see the most opportunities? We're hearing a lot of talk about food and agriculture and the tariffs involved there, renewable energy partnerships as well. Where do you see the most gains for countries like the UAE or Saudi?
So I think the first thing to say is a trade deal is nice to have, but it's not essential. I mean, these are already quite open economies in global terms. They already have strong trading relationships with the UK. A trade deal could help reduce some of the barriers, but it's not. I think it's not the biggest game in town. I think the broader picture is, as you suggest, really, is looking at the sectors where UK innovation, in particular, can help achieve the long-term strategic aims of countries like Saudi and UAE states. So if you look at some of the real strengths I mentioned medtech and health technology, things like digital health, where you have a lot of innovation in the UK market, which is often underpinned by the fact that you have this almost unique data set because you have a huge national health service covering sort of 60 million people. So you have a great base in which to work from, and there's a reason why pre-Brexit the UK was a favoured destination for things like clinical trials and bringing new drugs to market. The health tech sector is very strong and growing, but again, there's a lot of small-scale innovation here that's essentially looking for investment and looking for ways to get to market or to scale it up. And I think the traditional model that people see, essentially salesmen coming out to the Gulf region with a suitcase full of products, is kind of a bit outdated now. Often what people are looking for is investment partnerships or regulatory openings to kind of the UAE in particular, I think, is a great place to bring your ideas to market and get regulatory approval that you can then look to scale them up for the global market and bring them back, for example, to the NHS in the UK. So that's one big sector. I think the creative sector is still a huge UK kind of global strength, which can be important for areas like tourism and culture, which some Gulf states have made a big investment in. There are areas like education that are traditional strengths and where there's already a presence in the region from the UK. The professional services I mentioned, banking and financial services is an obvious one, but we increasingly see, I think, legal and accounting services, as well as sort of management consultancy, the kind of world that I'm working in, establishing and growing their presences in the region. I think there's a big other area, which is the technology around net zero, getting to net zero, but helping that make that sustainable and build economies that will be fast growing and rich and high skilled beyond the dependence on hydrocarbons. So I think there's a lot there. And I think you can already see that investors get this. You can already see that sovereign wealth funds in the region are investing in some of these sectors. And in some cases, I think part of that deal, what they're looking for in a partnership, is to bring some of those skills back home to the region so that they can be used to help build up the domestic high skills and high tech that will be needed sort of longer term into the century to keep high growing rich economies in the Gulf region. So there's a lot there, I think. Whether or not we have a trade deal, or how ambitious or how rapid that trade deal is.
Okay, well, let's talk about some of the challenges that are involved, because in recent months it's become clear that a number of GCC governments are forming closer ties with China. Many of them have also adopted a less hawkish approach to Russia. Do you see that hindering talks with the UK at all?
To be honest, I'm not sure that it will, for two reasons. I think, as we touched on before, I think there is a a greater recognition of the strategic importance of the Gulf region for the UK and for the West generally because of the war in Russia, because of what that means for energy prices and long-term energy needs. But I think the other point is that the region is actually very strongly placed. If the West is going to, global West, if you like, including places like Japan, if it's going to decouple from China, and that will be a slow process, and it will be greater or lesser in some countries rather than others, then it needs the Gulf. And the Gulf states are well placed. They're in a strong position economically. Their economies are growing fast. They've had a boost from the high global energy prices. I mean, a significant boost. The IMF, I think, estimates that as more than $1 trillion. And there are certainly strong signs that their economies are more sustainable and are starting to deliver that kind of sustainable growth beyond hydrocarbons that put them in a very strong position. They'll continue to have strong links with China. There's going to be more friction, I think, in the relationships, and you've seen that, at the absolute top level with the US and Saudi. And I think that greater friction, probably that greater assertiveness on the point of the Gulf states, is just part of the new reality, the new geopolitical landscape. For the UK and Europe, I think you come back to the fundamentals. The US has energy independence. The UK and the EU don't. And they won't have for quite a while. And it will be expensive and slow to get there. So there's definitely a sort of world later this century where we're getting towards net zero. There's the UK and Europe generally are much more energy independent, from renewable sources. But that's decades away. And in the meantime, they don't have the luxury, really, I think, of ignoring the Gulf or not having to, compromise and work with the region. It's a more important strategic partner than ever. So the Gulf states are very well placed.
So what is the greatest barrier to a trade deal between the UK and the Arab world? There's currently no comprehensive framework to govern and regulate the agreements, such as tariffs or rules of origin. So how can officials move forward with negotiations without a clear and agreed upon framework?
Yes, I in a way, I wonder if the technical barriers are really the most difficult issue. I think that the UK and Western governments generally always wrestle with some public opinion and campaigning groups at home on some of the values agenda, and they always worry about that can be squared off with the needs of the strategic relationship with the Gulf. And that will continue to be an issue. But I think the strategic reality is that the UK needs the Gulf. The partnerships are already very strong, and the opportunities are there whether or not we do a trade deal. Now, there are technical barriers and there are politics within that about market access in a number of sectors. But I think it's just not the same order of difficulty as you have with, for example, the Trans-Pacific and what that means for market access to UK agriculture and UK farmers. You don't have the same sort of big pressure points with domestic constituencies in the UK. So there are barriers, no doubt, but I think I think those problems are resolvable. But even if they're not, I think if we zoom out again from the trade deal, you don't need the trade deal to seize these opportunities. I think in the sectors where the UK is world leading.
I mean, they obviously have quite different opinions when it comes to things like labour laws, environmental standards as well. It sounds like you're saying you don't see any of them as hindering progress, though.
Well, they're not showstoppers, I think, necessarily. The deal is doable. It's probably more about political will in London.
In retrospect, with all of the mess that followed Brexit, don't you agree that leaving the EU was a big mistake?
Well, everyone has their personal view on this. But I think what's significant and kind of interesting are two things. One is that seems to be increasingly the view of a majority of British public opinion. And there's pretty consistent polling now over time that suggests an ever-growing number of the British public feel that Brexit was a mistake and has brought costs and very, very few benefits. So that's an underlying and probably growing reality. But I think the second thing is it's happened, and it's now baked in to the two main parties' electoral coalitions. So the only two parties who will realistically lead a government in London for different reasons have come to the same conclusion that they can't really touch Brexit. They can't revisit the trade deal in a fundamental way. Now, there is a review of the trade deal at the 5-year point, which comes in 2025. And I think it's clear that if Labour win the election, they will want to improve the terms of the trade deal without changing its fundamental character. So changes at the margin.
But what is your personal opinion? Don't you agree that leaving the EU was a big mistake? You touched on some of the issues there. We saw Brexit weakening the pound, which drove up inflation, reduced purchasing power, huge disruption in trade and investment. It also caused a lot of political uncertainty, with the UK government negotiating a very long and complex trade deal with the EU. And ultimately, the UK has lost access to the EU single market. It means we've seen a loss of so many other benefits that came with being a part of the EU. British citizens now stand in line at EU airports.
Well, I think it's clear that the downsides are huge, and they're not just economic. I mean, as you kind of suggest, they're political, and lots of people worried about this at the time. I wasn't actually working in government at the time that these negotiations, working on these issues at the time that these negotiations were happening. But it's very clear, I think, that the hit to Britain's reputation for political stability, which is at the core of its soft power, has been in some ways even worse than the economic hit, as you say, from loss of market access. You can't change geography. If you have much more limited access to your main market on your doorstep, there's going to be a big hit to trade and ultimately to prosperity. But the hit to political stability, because the government has, under successive prime ministers, has been trying to make something work that fundamentally it hasn't been honest about the trade-offs. It's been denying that there were trade-offs. That's still going on a little bit with Northern Ireland, for example. And that dishonesty has been corrosive in British political and public life, and there's a price to pay for that, right? Brexit was a kind of revolution, and there's always disruption in a revolution, and there's always normally an economic hit because of that. So we're only now starting to emerge from that, I think. And I used to say to company boards when I started presenting to them when I moved out of diplomatic service, it took 13 years for the UK to join the old EEC, the EU in the 1970s, and it will probably take the same amount of time before you have a stable future relationship between the UK and the EU that both main parties subscribe to. Well, we're 7 years in, and there's no sign of it yet. So this still has a long way to run. It's a generational change, and I think what public opinion definitely suggests is it was a generational mistake.
So certainly more political economic turmoil to come. In terms of improving relations, though, between the UK and the Arab part of the world, if the UK does fail to sign a specific deal with the GCC as a whole, do you think that the UK has the option to look at single individual trade deals with countries like the UAE, Saudi Arabia or Qatar?
Yes, indeed, and it's been doing some of that already. It's been signing agreements, not sort of full scope free trade agreements, but it's been signing individual agreements across some sectors with some of the GCC members, like Qatar, and I think that would continue. There's clearly an issue politically for London if, having put so much political emphasis on the importance of a GCC deal, the government isn't able to deliver that, then it does call into question its commitment to free trade and to making the compromises necessary to put the trading relationship with the region on a new footing. But I do come back to this fundamental point. Whatever the governments do, those economic fundamentals ought to be attractive to Gulf investors, whether that's at the state, kind of sovereign wealth fund level, or kind of business level, because some of those strengths of the UK economy, innovation across several sectors, can really be part of the answer, I think, to what Gulf economies need to do and know they need to do to build sustainable post-net zero, high-skilled economies for the 21st century. But there's no doubt it would be a failure of political will if that deal isn't done.
Certainly some huge opportunities for collaboration. Well, we wish you a successful visit at Arab Health, Mr. Paul McGrade. Thank you for joining us today on Frankly Speaking. We appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Katie.